Donald Trump's opposition to a digital dollar was one of the many reasons the crypto industry endorsed him so fervently in 2024. And once he was back in the White House, the Donald was as good as his word. The executive order was signed, the headlines were printed, and a generation of crypto skeptics declared the central bank digital currency dead on arrival. Well, nope, not exactly. While retail investors and policy commentators were busy celebrating the prohibition on a Federal Reserve-issued retail digital currency, the United States Senate, the Treasury Department, and the leadership of the largest commercial banks in the country were constructing the regulatory scaffolding for something architecturally identical and arguably far more invasive. A privately issued, Treasury-supervised, fully programmable digital dollar that runs through stablecoins backed entirely by short-duration government debt. So today, we reveal exactly how the Genius Act became the de facto digital dollar of the United States, why this framework solves Washington's debt refinancing crisis at the direct expense of every consumer who touches it, and which equities are positioned to capture the rents from the most consequential monetary shifts in half a century. My name is DC, and you're watching The Coin Bureau. On the 23rd of January 2025, President Trump signed Executive Order 14178, formally titled Strengthening American Leadership in Digital Financial Technology, which prohibited federal agencies from ever undertaking any action to establish, issue, or promote a central bank digital currency within the United States. The stated rationale invoked privacy, sovereignty, and protection from government surveillance, all of the language that the crypto community had spent years demanding from Washington. But buried inside the very same order was a parallel directive that explicitly promoted privately issued dollar-backed stablecoins as the preferred path forward for digital payment infrastructure. This was not a contradiction, but instead the entire point. Because just under 6 months later, on the 18th of July 2025, the president signed the Guiding and Establishing National Innovation for US Stablecoins Act, known across Washington as the Genius Act, into permanent federal law. The new framework mandates that every dollar of stablecoin supply must be backed one-to-one by short-duration US Treasury bills, cash, or overnight repurchase agreements held against those same treasuries. It creates a federal charter for what the legislation calls permitted payment stablecoin issuers, requiring any issuer with more than $10 billion in outstanding supply to obtain direct supervision from the Treasury, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and the FDIC. And critically, it explicitly prohibits any stablecoin issuer from paying interest, yield, or any equivalent return to the consumer holding the token. The retail user gets convenience, the issuer gets the entire reserve income, and the Treasury gets a legally mandated, perpetually growing class of buyers for its short-dated debt at exactly the moment foreign creditors are all heading for the exit. To understand why this architecture is so much more than a regulatory housekeeping exercise, you have to look at the precise mechanism by which stablecoin growth has become the single most important new source of marginal demand for US government debt. According to the December 2025 attestation prepared by BDO, Tether's total exposure to US Treasury instruments reached a record $141 billion by the end of last year, with direct holdings alone exceeding $122 billion. This single private company, which discloses its books quarterly and is domiciled in El Salvador, now ranks as the 17th largest holder of American government debt anywhere on Earth. Tether holds more treasuries than Germany, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, or the United Arab Emirates. When you combine Tether's position with Circle's reserve fund, which the BlackRock-managed Circle Reserve Fund disclosed, at $68.167 billion as of the 20th of March this year, the two-issuer bloc collectively controls approximately $200 billion of short-duration sovereign debt. That is a treasury position larger than every individual European holder on the International Capital Report. Now, you might assume that this concentration is simply an organic consequence of stablecoin demand and represents nothing more than private innovation finding a profitable niche. However, that assumption ignores the precise macroeconomic backdrop against which this absorption is occurring. Foreign holders of American treasuries have been steadily reducing their exposure for 2 consecutive years. Chinese holdings collapsed to $682 billion by November 2025, which is the lowest level since 2008 and a reduction of nearly 47% from the 2013 peak. Foreign investors now collectively hold only 32.4% of outstanding US treasuries, the smallest share since 1997 according to Morgan Stanley analysis. Global central bank gold reserves crossed $5 trillion in early 2026, surpassing official foreign holdings of US treasuries for the first time in roughly 30 years. Now, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been remarkably candid about how this gap is intended to be closed. In a public statement on the 6th of February this year, Bessent said, and I quote, "We believe that with the US having the safest, soundest, best practices, we can draw in new sources of funding via the stablecoin mechanism." Yes, stablecoins are the policy. Bessent has separately projected that the stablecoin market could grow into a multi-trillion-dollar industry that absorbs as much as $2 trillion of incremental treasury demand by the end of the decade. So the Genius Act is the legal instrument through which Washington has manufactured a captive, structurally growing domestic substitute for the foreign creditor base it can no longer rely upon. This is the 21st century version of post-war financial repression. You see, between 1942 and 1951, the Federal Reserve held long-term treasury yields at 2.5% and short-term bill yields at 37.5 basis points, well below where free markets should have priced them, allowing the government to finance its enormous wartime debt while inflation quietly eroded the real returns of every American who held a savings bond. The architecture may have changed, but the principle is identical. Today's mechanism does not require capital controls or interest rate ceilings. It only requires a stablecoin holder who never receives the yield his deposits are earning at the Treasury auction. Now, the reason we are able to break down legislative architecture like the Genius Act in the same week it gets implemented is because our research team is tracking these monetary policy developments full-time. If you want that same analysis delivered directly to your inbox every week, the Coin Bureau newsletter is where we publish our deep dives on global finance, central bank policy, and the macro forces shaping digital asset markets. It's completely free, it lands in your inbox every Sunday, and you can sign up using the link in the description below or by scanning the QR code on the screen right now. All right, back to it, because the macroeconomic mechanism is only the first layer of what Genius actually does. The deeper consequence is what happens to the consumer who holds the token. Consider the arithmetic from the perspective of a household. You deposit $10,000 into a regulated stablecoin to use it as a payment medium. Now, under the Genius Act framework, you are explicitly forbidden from receiving any interest on that balance. The issuer takes your deposit, purchases 3-month treasury bills currently yielding 3.7% and pockets approximately $370 per year per $10,000 of supply. Tether alone reported more than $10 billion of net profit across 2025, generated almost entirely through this exact spread. The seigniorage that historically belonged to the central bank and which a properly designed retail CBDC could in theory have returned to the public has been privatized and redirected to a small cluster of regulated issuers and the Treasury that funds itself through their reserve purchases. But the consumer cost extends far beyond the foregone interest because the architecture being built is not merely a payment system. It is a programmable, censorship-enabled, fully traceable substitute for cash that operates under a legal mandate to comply with any future government instruction. Consider what is already documented as operational precedent. On the 8th of August 2022, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, or OFAC, sanctioned the Tornado Cash Protocol, adding open source software code to its specially designated nationals list for the first time in American history. Within hours, Circle had blacklisted addresses associated with the protocol, freezing assets across the network before any court had reviewed the legality of the underlying action. The Fifth Circuit later ruled in November 2024 that OFAC had exceeded its authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act because immutable software code is not property, and Treasury formally delisted Tornado Cash in March of last year. But the demonstration had already been delivered. The infrastructure to freeze any wallet on any chain at any government request worked exactly as designed. And here's where the story gets considerably worse for anyone who values financial privacy. On the 8th of April this year, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN, and OFAC jointly issued the proposed rules implementing the Genius Act's anti-money laundering provisions, formally requiring every permitted payment stablecoin issuer to maintain the technical capability to block, freeze, and reject suspicious transactions. So this is no longer a voluntary compliance gesture, it is a federally mandated feature of the digital dollar architecture. Tether has already disclosed freezing more than 7,200 addresses and approximately $3.3 billion of supply between 2023 and 2025. Circle has frozen hundreds of additional addresses across the same window. In March of this year, Circle froze 16 operational business wallets in response to a sealed civil case before reversing the action following an industry backlash. And of course, we should absolutely trust this exact infrastructure to remain narrowly targeted at criminals and to never, under any future administration, be redirected against political opponents, dissident groups, or simply citizens whose payment patterns have been algorithmically flagged as inconvenient. Right? The trade-off you're being offered is genuinely simple to understand once the marketing language is all stripped away. You surrender the privacy, censorship resistance, and operational resilience that physical cash has provided for centuries in exchange for a token that someone else controls, that earns you nothing, that can be frozen at any moment, and that depends on functional internet, functional power, and the ongoing solvency of a private issuer. And this brings us to the ultimate consequence of the architecture, which is the complete absorption of decentralized settlement infrastructure into the regulated banking sector by the very institutions that spent the past decade insisting this technology was a fraud. Recall that in September of 2017, Jamie Dimon told an investor conference that Bitcoin was a fraud and threatened to fire any JP Morgan trader stupid enough to touch it. He has spent the better part of a decade calling cryptocurrency variously a pet rock, a tool for criminals, and an asset with fundamentally no value whatsoever. And then finally, in October of last year, on stage at the Future Investment Initiative in Riyadh, Dimon said the following: "Crypto is real, blockchain is real, stablecoins are real." In his April 2026 annual shareholder letter, Dimon went further, formally identifying stablecoins, tokenization platforms, and smart contract infrastructure as a whole new set of competitors to JP Morgan's core deposit and payment franchises. But rest assured, this is not an ideological conversion. No. JP Morgan's blockchain settlement platform, rebranded from Onyx to Kinexys, now processes more than $5 billion of institutional flow every single day, with cumulative volume exceeding $3 trillion since inception and an explicit internal target to double daily volume in the near term. The bank's deposit token, JPMD, is now live on Coinbase's Base network and is being progressively integrated into the Canton network throughout this year. Elsewhere, BlackRock's tokenized money market fund, BUIDL, BUIDL, holds between $1.7 and $2 billion of assets and is now tradable on Uniswap by whitelisted institutions. Larry Fink described the broader transformation in his March 2026 chairman's letter as comparable to the internet in 1969, with BlackRock now managing approximately $150 billion of assets linked directly to digital markets. Every layer of this architecture extracts a fee. Every layer removes assets from independent custody, and every layer concentrates control over money itself inside the precise institutions that the original peer-to-peer cash vision was designed to circumvent. And the equity beneficiaries form a remarkably tight cluster. Circle, currently trading just above $105 per share with a market cap of around $28 billion, sits in the middle of the regulated issuer arms race after receiving conditional OCC approval in December last year to operate as the first national digital currency bank. Coinbase captures the full reserve interest on USDC held within its custodial platform, plus half of the income on off-platform supply, an agreement that comes up for renegotiation later this year. BNY Mellon now custodies the Circle Reserve Fund, BlackRock's BUIDL, the securitized tokenized CLO product, and the Goldman Sachs digital asset platform. And its share price has risen more than 15% year to date, the strongest performer across the entire basket. State Street is up nearly 13% across the same window. Visa launched USDC settlement on Solana in December and is now committed as a validator on Circle's forthcoming Arc blockchain. MasterCard acquired the stablecoin infrastructure firm BVNK for up to $1.8 billion in March of this year, and PayPal's PiUSD supply has grown more than 500% across 2025 to roughly $4 billion. So the rails are being built, and the only remaining question is who collects the toll? Of course, the entire architecture carries one significant tail risk that the political consensus prefers not to discuss. In March of 2023, Circle disclosed that approximately $3.3 billion of USDC reserves were held at Silicon Valley Bank at the moment regulators shut it down. USDC traded as low as 87 cents over the following 24 hours. MakerDAO's DAI followed it down through collateral linkage, and the peg only recovered because the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, and the Treasury jointly invoked a systemic risk exception to guarantee uninsured depositors at SVB beyond the legal limit. So the stablecoin architecture was rescued by the very sovereign backstop it was nominally designed to operate independently of. Scale that incident to the current $200 billion combined reserve position, and the systemic implications become considerably more uncomfortable. So the CBDC ban, executed in January of last year, has functioned as the most successful misdirection in modern American monetary policy. While the public conversation has focused on a debate about retail digital currency that the administration was never going to lose, Washington has built the regulatory framework, the institutional pipeline, and the bipartisan consensus to digitize every dollar in the economy through privately issued, Treasury-supervised, programmable stablecoins. The framework solves the federal debt refinancing problem by manufacturing a captive domestic buyer of short-duration paper. It transfers seigniorage from the public to a small cluster of regulated issuers through a legally enforced prohibition on consumer yield. And it embeds the technical capability to freeze any balance, restrict any transaction, and trace any payment into the foundational architecture of the dollar itself. The convenience is real, but the cost is also very real. This is no longer a hypothetical future risk that can be dismissed as paranoid speculation about technologies that have not yet been deployed. No, sir. This is the operational reality of the American payment system being executed in real time across the next 18 months under the explicit endorsements of the Treasury Secretary, the leadership of the largest commercial banks in the country, and the world's largest asset manager. But what do you think? Will the Genius Act framework genuinely strengthen the US dollar's reserve currency status, or is this the opening chapter of a programmable monetary system that future administrations will inevitably weaponize? Please get highly opinionated in the comment section down below. And if you want to understand exactly how the US Treasury bond market is adjusting to absorb this new wave of digital demand, then you should definitely check out our deep dive video right over here. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you again very soon. This is DC signing off.